The 2015 VCAA accounting exam was 100 marks and the average result was 49. So what that meant was all the students were placed on a bell curve and the middle or median score was 49 out of 100. So 50% of kids got higher than 49 out of 100 and 50% of kids got lower than 49 out of 100. Looking at the actual exam grades or the scores you needed to get for each exam grade, like past years, obviously it's an exam, so it's much tougher. So the score you needed for each grade is much lower than it would be on a SAC. So for example, if you got 20%, that got you a D+. If you got 41%, that got you a C+. At the higher end, we can see that to get an A+, you actually needed 85%, which was a little higher than the year before and back in line with what the exam probably used to be. Now on your SACs, usually you need a score of 90%, 92% or more to get an A+, but obviously on the exam you're not expected to do as well as your regular SACs, which are just based on one topic at a time. And to get an A+, you needed 85%. So what's good is to go and look at previous years and compare that to past exams, and that gives you a good gauge of how difficult the exam was. If that A+ figure is really low, so in the past it's been down near 75%, that means it was a very tough paper. If it's a higher percentage, so if it's back at 90, 92%, that means the exam was a little bit easier and probably more in line with the difficulty of the SACs you did throughout the year. Looking at the mean score by question, so we're looking at question 1. We can see the black line is actually the 49, the exam average. So question 1 was done above average, which is usually the case. Everybody starts usually on question 1 and their mind's fresh and they're ready to go. Interesting enough though, in the start of the exam, people did struggle on question 2. As we go along, what we tend to find is that the average towards the back end of the exam does get a bit lower because obviously a lot of people don't finish. But what's interesting to note here is that there were some really good results on question 8, even some of question 9. So kids probably did do well at the end of the exam, but you can see in the middle there at question 5, there's some really lower scores. So when we go through question 5, we want to look at what was on that. And if I'm the examiner, I'm probably going to look at that content again in future years, just because it hasn't been obviously done particularly well. So we want to pay particular emphasis to question 5 and also question 3. The 3 high scores were 75, 67 and 70 as an average. So you can see all of those are actually in the second half of the exam, so disproving usually the stronger results at the start. And the lower scores were in the middle there, which was interesting just based on the difficulty of the question rather than kids not finishing. Looking at the percentage of students who got 0, so that's always a good figure to look at by question. So again, usually it's quite low at the start of the exam, and then as it goes on, it usually gets a lot higher. So we can see for question 5, that's really, really high. So 69% of kids got 0 on question 5C, for example. And basically for all 3 out of the 4 questions in question 5, over half of the kids couldn't actually get a score. They all registered 0. Let's look at the marks breakdown. So we've got practical and theory questions, where a theory question requires a written answer, a practical question requires some sort of report or document or accounting template to be filled in. We had 65 marks versus 35 for theory, which is usually in line with roughly what the split is. We know there's going to be between 30 and 40% of the exam will be theory, and that was true in 2015. Looking at the 10 best questions, so we look at the exam average was 49, that's the black line. And then these were the 10 best questions. So as you can see, there was basically the 10th best question was basically about average. So that shows that most of the questions are quite difficult. We can also see that the blue ones are practical, the yellow ones are theory. There's actually 2 theory questions in there that were in the top 10, so 6A and question 9. So that's interesting. So go and have a look at those and see what they were about. Looking at the 10 worst questions, we can see the exam average was 49, and obviously all 10 were below that. The worst question was 5C, that was 18%, so that was a theory question. So again, we do want to focus on question 5 during our revision. We can also see that there's also a nice mix there of practical and theory. We probably expect more theory questions to be in there, but interesting to note that there's 5 practical questions there, which are in the bottom 10. So maybe focus your revision there because, again, the examiner is probably going to refocus on those in future years. Looking at the marks by question type, so what the question actually wants you to do, there was 1 mark for calculate, 2 marks for complete, 12 for discuss, and so on. And what's interesting to note is that by far the highest number of marks were for prepare, so 43 marks. We also had 9 and 10 for record and show. So what does that actually mean? Well, they're the questions that usually get you to prepare, record or show things like the journals, stock cards, ledgers, and also reports. So they're practical questions and they're always going to be there. So we want to go back through past exams and look for prepare, record and show questions. From a theoretical perspective, the two highest categories of marks were discuss, which is interesting, and we'll talk about that in a second, and explain. So what does that mean? Well, discuss says examine an issue and state arguments or opinions covering both sides of the issue. And explain, it's a little easier, basically just means to make the meaning of something clear and understandable. So a discuss question is a little more difficult than an explain, but we should always expect on every exam there's going to be quite a few explain marks. So if we go through past exams, we'll see the same thing. Looking at the discuss questions, it's interesting to note that there was 12 marks for discuss. There was 6 for a question covering relevance versus reliability when you depreciate non-current assets. And there was another 6 for strategies to improve cash flow with regard to debtors turnover and creditors turnover. So what's interesting to note is that in past years, there's only been 6 marks for discuss. So in 2014, the one discuss question was to discuss the profitability of the firm with regard to its net profit margin, asset turnover, and return on assets. So a different question than in 2015. And in 2013, again, there was only 6 marks and there was one discuss question. And that was discussing the cash flow statement of the firm, which was actually a budgeted cash flow statement. So it was quite a broad question, not quite as specific as the ones in 2015, particularly that one for improving the cash flow. So that's interesting to note, to look at past exams, what the discuss questions have been about, and make sure we review those so we know that if that question or a variation of it comes up, we can answer it. Looking at 2015, the ledgers that you were asked to complete were debtors control, prepaid rent, capital, and GST clearing. 2014, the ledgers were as follows, and in 2013, the ledgers were as follows as well. So what we want to do is look at and see, well, what are the ones that are probably always going to be there, because there's some core ledgers that everybody needs to know, and then there's going to be some odds and ends ledgers which may or may not appear. So if we look at the last 3 years, we can see there's always debtors control and a debtor subsidiary, maybe both, as you can see in 2014. What's interesting to note is that there's been no creditors control ledger or a creditor subsidiary ledger in the last 3 years. So for our revision, we probably want to make sure we know creditors control, what makes it go up, what makes it go down, what's a debit, what's a credit, given that the examiner hasn't assessed it in the last 3 years, making it a really prime candidate to be on the paper in future years. You can also see that we have the capital ledger has popped up every year, so we need to know that, what makes it go up, what makes it go down, debits and credits, that's really important. We can see the GST clearing ledger has appeared in 2 out of the 3 years. That's kind of a core ledger that we always need to know. And then we've got some odds and ends, but interestingly enough, in 2 out of the last 3 years, there's been ledgers requiring the completion of the disposal of asset account, and sometimes the actual asset account associated with it. So disposal of generator and generator in 2013, and then disposal of equipment in 2014. You can also see that there's kind of a miscellaneous prepaid expense account in 2015 and 14. So it's very important you know how to treat a prepaid rent or prepaid advertising, prepaid wages account, and what we do on balance day to that account and how we balance it for the future. Looking at the reports that you've been required to complete in the last 3 years, in 2015, the balance sheet, you had to do the current liability section only. Whereas in 2014, you actually had to do the entire report. Interestingly enough, in 2013, there actually was no balance sheet to complete, but that doesn't matter. We always want to know that we could be expected to complete an entire balance sheet, even if it hasn't been asked on every paper. Looking at the income statement, in 2015, we had to do the entire report. In 2014, we had to do just down to adjusted gross profit, and in 2013, we also had to do just down to adjusted gross profit. And the report that actually has appeared the most in past exams in recent times has been the cash flow statement. So in 2015, you actually had to do 2. One question focused on financing activities and one question focused on operating activities. In 2014, though, you actually had to do the entire report. And in 2013, you had to do just the operating activities. So obviously, it's impossible to predict what you'll have to do on the exam. But what's interesting to note is that in the last 3 years, you've either at one point had to do an entire balance sheet an entire income statement, and an entire cash flow statement. So it's really important you know those reports and how to complete all of them, even if on the exam you're only asked to provide a part of them. Looking at the examiner's comments, these are often overlooked by students. You want to go through these with a fine-tooth comb just to find some comments and tips from the examiner. So in 2015, it was interesting to note there were only 10 questions. That differed to 12 in 2014. And I think what's probably more important is you look at, well, if you add up question 1A, B, C, 2A, 2B, and so on, there was actually 24 responses required. So that's interesting because in 2012, there was not only 12 questions, you had to do 27 things. So based on the assumption that it's easier to complete fewer questions in the amount of time, the difficulty seems to have gone down a little bit. And that's in line with 2013 as well, because 2013, whilst it was only 10 questions, it was 27 responses as well. So we do want to plan for the worst and expect 27 or more, but it's interesting to note the exam seemed to focus on fewer questions, but each topic in more detail perhaps. While the exam will always be similar, the focus of the questions will vary, so it's important to revise all areas of the course. So that's obviously a generic statement that they put into the report every year. And basically what it's just saying is don't try and predict exactly what will be on the exam. Make sure you know everything. Whilst there are going to be things that are more likely to appear than others, and we can plan for that, we do want to make sure we don't ignore any topic, because any topic in the study design is accessible on the exam. Time management, again, was an issue. Even though there were fewer responses and questions, some students didn't finish, and it's really important to look at the marks allocated for each question. Now, it's going to be harder to finish theory questions than it is practical questions in the amount of time provided, but what you want to do for each question is realize that there's 120 marks and 100 minutes. So for every question, that's 1.2 minutes per mark. So we've got a 3-mark theory, 5-mark practical. We want to always times that by 1.2 minutes just to get a rough guide of where we want to be at what point in the exam. It's important to carefully read the details of the question. So the examiner pointed this out with 2 examples. Question 5, the question said all sales and purchases are made on credit, yet in the response, many students actually included cash sales. So make sure you read the question, because that's a really important detail that if you started talking about cash sales, you were technically wrong because there were no cash sales for that business. This one's quite disappointing because the question said the debt or gearing ratio was provided, whereas a lot of students actually responded with reference to debtors and not debt or the debt ratio, which are completely different things. So make sure you read the details of each question very clearly. Interestingly enough, as we saw earlier, there were 2 times discuss questions, usually only 1. And what's really important is that you can discuss something. So not only don't worry about topics, you revise those as you go, but what does discuss mean? It basically means looking at the viewpoints. It's going to depend on the topic that you're given, but it could be positives versus negatives, advantages versus disadvantages, pros versus cons, strengths versus weaknesses, benefits versus limitations. But I think that's a really important area to go through all the topics that could potentially be discussed. So look at past exams and speak to your teacher about possible topics as well. And just start to make those lists, positives, negatives, strengths, weaknesses, and so on.